This book has a goal: to get people to think differently about moral responsibility, blame and praise, and the notion of our being free agents, and to feel differently about those issues as well. And most of all, to change fundamental aspects of how we behave. My goal isn't to convince you that there's no free will. It will suffice if you merely conclude that there's so much less free will than you thought that you have to change your thinking about some truly important things. The approach of this book is to show how determinism works, to explore how the biology over which you had no control, interacting with environment over which you had no control, made you, you. And when people claim that there are causeless causes of your behavior that they call free will, they have A. failed to recognize or not learned about the determinism lurking beneath the surface, or B. erroneously concluded that the rarefied aspects of the universe that do work indeterministically can explain your character, morals, and behavior. The easy takeaway from the first half of this book is that the biological determinants of our behavior stretch widely over space and time, responding to events in front of you this instant, but also to events on the other side of the planet, or that shaped your ancestors centuries back. And those influences are deep and subterranean, and our ignorance of the shaping forces beneath the surface leads us to fill in the vacuum with stories of agency. Just to restate that irritatingly familiar by now notion, we are nothing more or less than the sum of that which we could not control: our biology, our environments, their interactions. The most important message was that these are not all separate ology fields producing behavior. They all merge into one. Evolution produces genes marked by the epigenetics of early environment, which produce proteins that, facilitated by hormones in a particular context, work in the brain to produce you. A seamless continuum leaving no cracks between the disciplines into which to slip some free will. The theme of the second half of this book is this: we've done it before. Over and over, in various domains, we've shown that we can subtract out a belief that actions are freely, willfully chosen, as we've become more knowledgeable, more reflective, more modern, and the roof has not caved in. Society can function without our believing that people with epilepsy are in cahoots with Satan, and that mothers of people with schizophrenia cause the disease by hating their child. What the science in this book ultimately teaches is that there is no meaning. There's no answer to why. Beyond, this happened because of what came just before, which happened because of what came just before that. There is nothing but an empty, indifferent universe in which occasionally atoms come together temporarily to form things we each call me. Determinism. When people claim that there are causeless causes of your behavior that they call free will, they have A. failed to recognize or not learned about the determinism lurking beneath the surface, or B. erroneously concluded that the rarefied aspects of the universe that do work indeterministically can explain your character, morals, and behavior. Every aspect of behavior has deterministic prior causes. Its antecedent causes all the way down, not a floating turtle or causeless cause to be found. When you behave in a particular way, which is to say when your brain has generated a particular behavior, It is because of the determinism that came just before, which was caused by the determinism just before that, and before that, all the way down. There's no answer to why, beyond. This happened because of what came just before, which happened because of what came just before that. Chaos theory. Unpredictable is not the same thing as undetermined. Reductive determinism is not the only kind of determinism. Chaotic systems are purely deterministic, shutting down that particular angle of proclaiming the existence of free will. Determinism allows you to explain why something happened, whereas predictability allows you to say what happens next. The critical mistake running through all of this: determinism and predictability are very different things. Even if chaoticism is unpredictable, it is still deterministic. A system being unpredictable doesn't mean that it is enchanted, and magical explanations for things aren't really explanations. Will we ever get to the point where our behavior is entirely predictable, given the deterministic gears grinding underneath? Never. That's one of the points of chaoticism. Emergent complexity. Emergent complexity, while being immeasurably cool, is nonetheless not where free will exists, for three reasons. Because of the lessons of chaoticism, you can't just follow convention and say that two things are the same when they are different, and in a way that matters, regardless of how seemingly minuscule that difference. Unpredictable doesn't mean undetermined. Even if a system is emergent, that doesn't mean it can choose to do whatever it wants. It is still made up of and constrained by its constituent parts, with all their mortal limits and foibles. Emergent systems can't make the bricks that built them stop being brickish. These properties are all intrinsic to a deterministic world, whether chaotic, emergent, predictable, or unpredictable. Simple rules about how components of a system interact locally, repeated a huge number of times with the huge numbers of those components, and out emerges optimized complexity, all without centralized authorities comparing the options and making freely chosen decisions. No matter how emergently cool, ant colonies are still made of ants that are constrained by whatever individual ants can or can't do, and brains are still made of brain cells that function like brain cells. No matter how unpredicted an emergent property in the brain might be, neurons are not freed of their histories once they join the complexity. The whole point of emergence, the basis of its amazingness, is that those idiotically simple little building blocks that only know a few rules about interacting with their immediate neighbors remain precisely as idiotically simple when their building block collective is outperforming urban planners with business cards. Downward causation doesn't cause individual building blocks to acquire complicated skills. Instead, it determines the contexts in which the blocks are doing their idiotically simple things. Individual neurons don't become causeless causes that defy gravity and help generate free will just because they're interacting with lots of other neurons. Philosophers discuss weak emergence, which is where no matter how cool, ornate, unexpected, and adaptive an emergent state is, it is still constrained by what its reductive bricks can and can't do. This is contrasted with strong emergence, where the emergent state that emerges from the micro can no longer be deduced from it, even in chaoticism's sense of a stepwise manner. quantum indeterminacy. Even if quantum effects bubbled up enough to make our macro world as indeterministic as our micro one is, this would not be a mechanism for free will worth wanting. That is, unless you figure out a way where we can supposedly harness the randomness of quantum indeterminacy to direct the consistencies of who we are. If you base your notion of being a free, willful agent on randomness, you got problems, as do the people stuck around you. It can be very unsettling when a sentence doesn't end in the way that you potato. If our behavior were rooted in quantum indeterminacy, it would be random when we argue about whether our behavior is the product of our agency. We're not interested in random behavior. We're interested in the consistency of behavior that constitutes our moral character, and in the consistent ways in which we try to reconcile our multifaceted inconsistencies. For our purposes, the main points are that in the view of most of the savants, the subatomic universe works on a level that is fundamentally indeterministic on both an ontic and epistemic level. Particles can be in multiple places at once, can communicate with each other over vast distances faster than the speed of light, making both space and time fundamentally suspect, and can tunnel through solid objects. It is perfectly plausible, maybe even inevitable, that there will be quantum effects on how things like ions interact with the likes of ion channels or receptors in the nervous system. However, there is no evidence that those sorts of quantum effects bubble up enough to alter behavior, and most experts think that it is actually impossible. Quantum strangeness is not that strange, and quantum effects are washed away amid the decohering warm, wet noise of the brain as one scales up. Even if quantum indeterminacy did bubble all the way up to behavior, there is the fatal problem that all it would produce is randomness. Do you really want to claim that the free will for which you deserve punishment or reward is based on randomness? The supposed ways by which we can harness, filter, stir up, or mess with the randomness enough to produce free will seem pretty unconvincing. Biology of behavior. There is nothing but an empty, indifferent universe in which occasionally atoms come together temporarily to form things we each call me, the biology over which you had no control, interacting with environment over which you had no control, made you you. All we are is the history of our biology over which we had no control, and of its interaction with environments over which we also had no control, creating who we are in the moment. Why did that behavior occur? Because of biological and environmental interactions, all the way down. Once you work with the notion that every aspect of behavior has deterministic, prior causes, you observe a behavior and can answer why it occurred. A second before behavior. The action of neurons in this or that part of your brain in the preceding second. Seconds to minutes before behavior. In the seconds to minutes before, those neurons were activated by a thought, a memory, an emotion, or sensory stimuli. We are being influenced by our sensory environment. A foul smell, a beautiful face, the feel of vomit goulash, a gurgling stomach, a racing heart. Our judgments, decisions, and intentions are also shaped by sensory information coming from our bodies, that is, interoceptive sensation. What sensory information flowing into your brain, including some you're not even conscious of, in the preceding seconds to minutes, helped form that intent? Hours to days before behavior. In the hours to days before that behavior occurred, the hormones in your circulation shaped those thoughts, memories, and emotions, and altered how sensitive your brain was to particular environmental stimuli. Consider the scads of different types of hormones in our circulation, each secreted at a different rate and affecting the brain in varied ways from one individual to the next, all without our control or awareness. The decisions you supposedly make freely, in moments that test your character, generosity, empathy, honesty, are influenced by the levels of these hormones in your bloodstream and the levels and variants of their receptors in your brain. The workings of every bit of the endocrine system will reflect whether you've been stressed recently by, say, a mean boss, a miserable morning's commute, or surviving your village being pillaged. Your gene variants will influence the production and degradation of glucocorticoids, as well as the number and function of glucocorticoid receptors in different parts of your brain. And the system would have developed differently in you depending on things like the amount of inflammation you experienced as a fetus, your parents' socioeconomic status, and your mother's parenting style. Thus, 3 different classes of hormones work over the course of minutes to hours to alter the decision you make. This just scratches the surface. Google list of human hormones, and you'll find more than 75 most affecting behavior, all rumbling below the surface, influencing your brain without your awareness. Months to years before behavior. In the preceding months to years, experience and environment changed how those neurons function, causing some to sprout new connections and become more excitable, and causing the opposite in others. It depends in part on events during previous weeks to years. Have you been barely managing to pay the rent each month, experiencing the emotional swell of finding love or of parenting, suffering from deadening depression, working successfully at a stimulating job, rebuilding yourself after combat trauma or sexual assault, having had a dramatic change in diet? All will change your brain and behavior beyond your control, often beyond your awareness. Moreover, there will be a meta-level of differences outside your control, in that your genes and childhood will have regulated how easily your brain changes in response to particular adult experiences. There is plasticity as to how much and what kind of neuroplasticity each person's brain can manage. Adolescence. From there, we hurtle back decades in identifying antecedent causes. Explaining why that behavior occurred requires recognizing how during your adolescence a key brain region was still being constructed, shaped by socialization and acculturation. By definition, if the frontal cortex is the last part of the brain to develop, it is the brain region least shaped by genes and most shaped by environment. If you want to be better at doing the harder thing as an adult, make sure you pick the right adolescence. The frontal cortex, with its roles in executive function, long-term planning, gratification postponement, impulse control, and emotion regulation, isn't fully functional in adolescence. What do you suppose that explains? Just about everything in adolescence especially when adding the tsunamis of estrogen, progesterone, and testosterone flooding the brain then. A juggernaut of appetites and activation, constrained by the flimsiest of frontal cortical brakes. The main point about delayed frontal maturation isn't that it produces kids who got really bad tattoos, but the fact that adolescence and early adulthood involve a massive construction project in the brain's most interesting part. The implications are obvious. If you're an adult, your adolescent experiences of trauma, stimulation, love, failure, rejection, happiness, despair, acne, the whole shebang, will have played an outsized role in constructing the frontal cortex you're working with. Of course, the enormous varieties of adolescence experiences will help produce enormously varied frontal cortexes in adulthood. The basic facts. A. When you're an adolescent, your prefrontal cortex, PFC, still has a ton of construction ahead of it. B. In contrast, the dopamine system, crucial to reward, anticipation, and motivation, is already going full blast, so the PFC hasn't a prayer of effectively reining in thrill-seeking, impulsivity, craving of novelty, meaning that adolescents behave in adolescent ways. C. If the adolescent PFC is still a construction site, this time of your life is the last period that environment and experience will have a major role in influencing your adult PFC. D. Delayed frontocortical maturation has to have evolved precisely so that adolescence has this influence. How else are we going to master discrepancies between the letter and the spirit of laws of sociality? Thus, adolescent social experience, for example, will alter how the PFC regulates social behavior in adults. Childhood. Further back, there's childhood experience, shaping the construction of your brain. There are massive amounts of construction of everything in the brain, a process of a smooth increase in the complexity or neuronal circuitry, and of myelination. Naturally, this is paralleled by growing behavioral complexity. Whether. The huge question then becomes, how do different childhoods produce different adults? Sometimes the most likely pathway seems pretty clear without having to get all neuroscience-y. For example, a study examining more than 1 million people across China and the US showed the effects of growing up in clement weather, that is, mild fluctuations around an average of 70 degrees. Such individuals are, on the average, more individualistic, extroverted, and open to novel experience. Likely explanation: the world is a safer, easier place to explore growing up when you don't have to spend significant chunks of each year worrying about dying of hypothermia and/or heat stroke when you go outside, where average income is higher and food stability greater. And the magnitude of the effect isn't trivial, being equal to or greater than that of age, gender, the country's GDP, population density, and means of production. The link between weather clemency in childhood and adult personality can be framed biologically in the most informative way. The former influences the type of brain you're constructing that you will carry into adulthood, as is almost always the case. Socioeconomic status. The socioeconomic status of a child's family predicts the size, volume, and gray matter content of the prefrontal cortex, PFC, in kindergartners. Same thing in toddlers, in 6-month-olds, in 4-week-olds. You want to scream at how unfair life can be. Lower socioeconomic status predicts worse PFC development. There are hints as to the mediators. By age 6, low status is already predicting elevated glucocorticoid levels. The higher the levels, the less activity in the PFC on average. Moreover, glucocorticoid levels in kids are influenced not only by the socioeconomic status of the family, but by that of the neighborhood as well. Increased amounts of stress mediate the relationship between low status and less PFC activation in kids. As a related theme, lower socioeconomic status predicts a less stimulating environment for a child. All those enriching extracurricular activities that can't be afforded. The world of single mothers working multiple jobs who are too exhausted to read to their child. As one shocking manifestation of this, by age 3, your average high socioeconomic status kid has heard about 30 million more words at home than a poor kid. And in one study, the relationship between socioeconomic status and the activity of a child's PFC was partially mediated by the complexity of language use at home. Adverse childhood experience. ACE score. How lucky was the childhood you were handed? This massively important fact has been formalized into an adverse childhood experience. ACE score. It queries whether someone experienced or witnessed physical, emotional, or sexual childhood abuse, physical or emotional neglect, or household dysfunction, including divorce, spousal abuse, or a family member mentally ill, incarcerated, or struggling with substance abuse. With each increase in someone's ACE score, there's an increased likelihood of a hyperreactive amygdala that has expanded in size and a sluggish PFC that never fully developed. For every step higher in one's ACE score, there is roughly a 35% increase in the likelihood of adult antisocial behavior, including violence, poor frontocortical-dependent cognition, problems with impulse control, substance abuse, teen pregnancy and unsafe sex and other risky behaviors, and increased vulnerability to depression and anxiety disorders. Oh, and also poorer health and earlier death. You'd get the same story if you flipped the approach 180 degrees. As a child, did you feel loved and safe in your family? Was there good modeling about sexuality? Was your neighborhood crime-free, your family mentally healthy, your socioeconomic status reliable and good? Well then, you'd be heading toward a high RLCE score, ridiculously lucky childhood experiences, predictive of all sorts of important good outcomes. Thus essentially every aspect of your childhood, good, bad, or in between, factors over which you had no control, sculpted the adult brain you have. Fetus womb. Not surprising, the general themes echo those of childhood. Lots of glucocorticoids from mom marinating your fetal brain, thanks to maternal stress, and there's increased vulnerability to depression and anxiety in your adulthood. What's in the maternal circulation, which will help determine what's in the fetus? Levels of a huge array of different hormones, immune factors, inflammatory molecules, pathogens, nutrients, environmental toxins, illicit substances, all which regulate brain function in adulthood. Low socioeconomic status for a pregnant woman or her living in a high-crime neighborhood both predict less cortical development at the time of the baby's birth, even back when the child was still in utero. And naturally, high levels of maternal stress during pregnancy. For example, loss of a spouse, natural disasters, or maternal medical problems that necessitate treatment with lots of synthetic glucocorticoids predict cognitive impairment across a wide range of measures, poorer executive function, decreased gray matter volume in the DLPFC, a hyperreactive amygdala, and a hyperreactive glucocorticoid stress response when those fetuses become adults. Genes. Moving further back, we have to factor in the genes you inherited and their effects on behavior. If you didn't choose the womb you grew in, you certainly didn't choose the unique mixture of genes you inherited from your parents. There's usually extensive individual variation in every relevant gene, and you weren't consulted as to which you'd choose to inherit people, differing in the flavors of genes they possess. Those genes being regulated differently in different environments, producing proteins whose effects vary in different environments. Genes are about potentials and vulnerabilities, not inevitabilities. Genes are turned on and off by environment. Most DNA is devoted to gene regulation rather than to genes themselves. Different environments will cause different sorts of epigenetic changes in the same gene or genetic switch. Thus, people have all these different versions of all of these, and these different versions work differently depending on childhood environment. Just to put some numbers to it, humans have roughly 20,000 genes in our genome. Of those, approximately 80% are active in the brain. 16,000. Of those genes, nearly all come in more than one flavor, are polymorphic. Does this mean that in each of those genes, the polymorphism consists of one spot in that gene's DNA sequence that can differ among individuals? No. There are actually an average of 250 spots in the DNA sequence of each gene, which adds up to there being individual variability in approximately 4 million spots in the sequence of DNA that codes for genes active in the brain. A crucial point about genes related to brain function, well, pretty much all genes, is that the same gene variant will work differently, sometimes even dramatically differently, in different environments. This interaction between gene variant and variation in environment means that ultimately you can't say what a gene does, only what it does in each particular environment in which it has been studied. There's coevolution of gene frequencies, cultural values, child development practices, reinforcing each other over the generations, shaping what your PFC is going to be like. Culture evolution. We're not done yet. That's because everything in your childhood, starting with how you were mothered within minutes of birth, was influenced by culture, which means as well by the centuries of ecological factors that influenced what kind of culture your ancestors invented, and by the evolutionary pressures that molded the species you belong to. Cultural differences arising centuries, millennia ago, influence behaviors from the most subtle and minuscule to dramatic. From your moment of birth, you are subject to a universal, which is that every culture's values include ways to make their inheritors recapitulate those values to become the sort of people you come from. As a result, your brain reflects who your ancestors were and what historical and ecological circumstances led them to invent those values surrounding you. Cultures produce dramatically different behaviors with consistent patterns. One of the most studied contrasts concerns individualist versus collectivist cultures.